So we think that the overall goal of all this and like investing in education and promoting for these students to actually go to metropolitan areas in the first place is to develop the economy as a whole and stimulate the economy enough so that these developing nations, which we have agreed are developing nations, right, will have the ability to actually develop these rural areas as a whole. And that is part of the long-term plan that we actually have in STAR, instead of keeping these students inside rural areas, which clearly have no benefit. Okay, so now I'll be moving on to my first rebuttal. So first of all, they can't say that there will be development in rural areas, as we already see that in developing nations, that these rural areas are not developed in the first place, that there's no infrastructure and there's no history of development in there. So for opposition to say that there will automatically be education and they will get job opportunities is completely untrue, because there are no companies set there to invest in these students. There's nobody willing to invest in the infrastructure to actually develop these rural areas in the first place, right? So we think that to say that there will be development, to say that they will get job opportunities is untrue, because there's simply no system for them to get a job in the first place. Okay, so first of all, I'll be talking about a few things in my speech. So I'm going to be talking about how we think that it's actually easier for students to use their education for something that will benefit the nation as a whole, and for something that will automatically benefit their community, the rural communities as a whole. Okay, so first of all, we think that countries can't develop rural areas, as they're already spending all their resources to develop their metropolitan areas in the first place. So okay, basically we think that, because since we already agree on the premise that these nations are developing, right? They're still trying to invest money. So if we take Malaysia as an example, we clearly see that even though we have a very developed capital city, right? We have a very rich metropolitan area. We see that still in so many other states, and basically the majority of the nation, right? It's still extremely underdeveloped in terms of infrastructure, in terms of education, right? So we think that how we think that this leads to a lack of quality education is something that was already analyzed in the first speech, but I'll just be reinstating it again because we think that this argument still stands. So we think that in terms of actually the economic viability of actually trying to deliver resources in the first place, we think that this is simply untrue, because in these rural areas, which if most developing nations is basically most of the country, right? Especially looking at the example of Malaysia, right? We think that actually trying to deliver resources such as textbooks, such as technology, and most importantly teachers, and building resources to make the school actually viable, no thank you, to actually make the school useful for these students in the first place, it's extremely not economically viable, first of all, because the majority of the country is underdeveloped, right? There's no infrastructure to actually support these to support the logistics of actually bringing in, these resources and these teachers, right? And of course, we've already given analysis on how we think that these teachers do not have any incentive to actually go to these rural areas in the first place, because their salaries will be cut, right? There will be no proper infrastructure for them to live a life as they would in a metropolitan area. So we think that this leads to the quality of education actually still continuing to stay subpar to metropolitan schools, which is something that we see in a lot of underdeveloped countries in the first place, right? Because we know that in underdeveloped nations there are schools, right? There are schools, there are teachers, but the reason why they're not developing in the first place is because the quality of education that is actually being given to these students are they're completely subpar, and even if they do get some sort of education, they will not be able to use it to their advantage, because there's simply no infrastructure, there's simply no economic development for them to get a job, to get a high-paying job, most importantly. Okay, so we've given analysis to how we think quality of education is staying subpar to metropolitan schools in terms of teachers, technology, internship opportunities, and also culture, which I'll be talking about later. Okay, so we think that, second of all, on my argument on how we think that actually giving them exposure to job opportunities is super important, and how we think that this is only exclusive to our side of the house. So we think that in underdeveloped nations, there's more tertiary sectors that rural students are able to go into, in comparison to rural areas where where industries are mostly concentrated in the primary and secondary sectors, right? So if we look at Malaysia as even though KL is an extremely developed part of Malaysia, right? We see that the reason why it's developed in the first place is because there's so much resources being put into it, right? Okay, so before I move on, yes, I'll accept a POI.
So if these areas are so poor as you say, isn't that exactly why we should invest into them? Because if we don't invest into them, that means the only way you ever want to help poor people is to send them to cities. Do you think this is sustainable in the long term?
So we have already explained why we think that this is not sustainable in the first place, right? Because we see that in the interest of in the interest of a developing nations, their interest is obviously to develop these concentrated areas of economic activity, right? And when you look at KL, there's no incentive for governments to actually invest in these rural areas because first of all, these areas in terms of landmass, in terms of population, they're way bigger than compared to how much the government can actually support. So we think that in terms of long-term development, actually sending these students instead of leaving them in impoverished areas with no proper education and no proper job opportunities is much better for the country in the long term and will actually be more likely to actually develop the nation as a whole. Okay, so we think that, second of all, we think that in terms of their argument on conservative families and how they'll not be able to use this this education opportunity to its fullest, we think that this is not true, and this can exist on both sides of the house. Because first of all, with conservative families that they say that they'll be quite skeptical to send their kids to these metropolitan areas. We think that the reason why it's actually more beneficial on our side of the house is that when there's pressure for these students to actually study, and when there's a culture saying that you study, you can succeed, right? Instead of the saying in a lot of conservative families, which is that you end your education after you end your primary education and then you continue to work on the farm, which is the general narrative of most families, right? So we think that when you send these students to metropolitan areas where they will be able to be exposed to these job opportunities, to these to this culture that says that education is important, right? That education is something that is valuable, something that will actually develop you as a person and will actually develop the nation as a whole. We think that this is something that can only be achieved on our side of the house, because even though you do have, they do say that on their side of the house, you have these rural schools, right? We think that even though these rural schools exist, even though that the education, let's say, is somewhat adequate, right? We think that the likeliness of these parents actually wanting their students to pursue a job, the likeliness that these parents are willing to send them into a job that is high paying, into a job that will actually develop the economy in terms of the long term benefits, we think that that's extremely unlikely, because as we've clearly seen in terms of rural, their mindset and their conservative values, we know that they value family, right? We know that they value their job in terms of the primary and the secondary sector. So we think that in terms of actually trying to promote economic stimulation, right? In terms of trying to promote growth, we think that this is something that can only be achieved on our side of the house. Thank you.